Beaten mute by her drunk husband, a cowboy took her in and gave her voice back. The rifle was the first thing I noticed. Not her, the rifle. A Winchester, 73 leaning against the side of my barn, barrel down in the mud, stock cracked near the grip like somebody had used it to break something, or tried to. I'd set that rifle against the fence the night before, oiling the action by lantern light, and I'd gone inside and left it when the rain came. And now it was here, moved a full 30 yards, leaning against the barn like somebody had carried it in the dark and just set it down careful. I stood in the yard with my coffee going cold in my hand, and looked at it for a long time. October, the Cimarron Flats. The morning cold had a teeth-gritting edge to it, the kind that says winter is coming and it doesn't care what you think about that. My name is Cal Dunmore, and I had been on this piece of ground going on 11 years by then, 160 acres of grass and scrub cedar. A stone house I'd built myself one wall at a time, a barn that listed slightly east. I was 54 years old. I had not spoken more than a few words to another person in better than 3 weeks, and some part of me had gotten comfortable with that. I walked over and picked up the rifle. The mud on the stock was fresh. Whatever happened had happened in the night, maybe close to morning. I looked at the barn. The door was latched from outside. I always latch it, but the latch was set wrong. I'd done it differently my whole life. Wooden peg through the iron ring at an angle, and this was straight through, the way somebody who'd only seen it once might set it. I stood there another minute. The horses in the small corral behind me were settled, not spooked. No dogs. I'd had a dog for 8 years and buried him the previous spring and hadn't replaced him. The wind came off the flats and rattled the dry sage, and that was all. I set the rifle against my leg, reached out and lifted the latch. She was in the far corner of the barn, behind the grain boxes, sitting in the straw with her knees pulled up and a horse blanket over her shoulders. She was looking straight at me. Not scared the way a caught animal looks. She'd been watching the door, waiting to see which way this was going to go, and she hadn't decided yet. She was somewhere past 30, I thought, maybe 35, maybe closer to 40, hard to tell because of the swelling. The left side of her face was wrong. The eye was shut from it. The cheekbone below it had a color on it I'd seen before, the deep plum going to black that means the blood is under the skin, and the bone underneath might or might not be whole. Her lip was split. There was blood dried into the collar of her dress, a dark brown crust on calico that had once been blue. She did not speak. I stood in the doorway and I looked at her, and she looked at me with the one good eye, and I thought several things more or less at once. I thought she belongs to somebody. I thought whoever she belongs to did that. And I thought she carried my rifle from the fence to the barn in the dark, and she set it down careful, which meant she wasn't planning to use it on me. She was just making sure I couldn't use it easy on her, and that was about as sensible a piece of thinking as I'd seen from a person in some time. I said, "You're cold." She didn't answer, not a shake of the head, not a sound. "I've got coffee," I said, "and a fire." "Nothing." "I'm not going to touch you," I said. "I'm going to go inside and leave the door open. You can come or not." I turned around and went back to the house. I didn't look back to see if she was following. I went inside, put the coffee pot back on the iron stove, got a second cup down from the shelf, and I sat in my chair by the window and waited. She came in about 10 minutes later, stood in the doorway with the horse blanket still around her shoulders, looking at the room. I pointed at the other chair, the one I didn't use, that had a blanket folded over the arm. She crossed the room and sat down and pulled the blanket around herself on top of the horse blanket, and she held the coffee cup with both hands when I poured it, and she stared into it. I didn't ask her anything, I just let the fire burn. Her name I didn't learn until the second day, and not because she told me. I found it when I walked the fence line east toward the Hale Road and came across what I'd half expected to find. A wagon, the left front wheel sunk to the axle in the ditch where the road dips near the creek crossing. A mule standing patient and miserable in the harness, ears back. And on the wagon seat, slumped sideways against the side rail, a man sleeping the sleep of the very deeply drunk. He'd run the wheel into the ditch, given up, and gone to sleep in the October cold, which told you what kind of drunk he was. The dead lucky kind. Or he'd been conscious enough to cover himself. There was a blanket over him that he hadn't been wearing when he went over, which told you something else. There was a carpet bag on the floor of the wagon. I left it. I went through his coat pockets until I found a letter. It was addressed to Mr. Clem Purdy, Rural Route 2, Hardesty. The handwriting on it was a woman's, careful, a little cramped. like she'd been taught properly and then not had much occasion to practice. I went back and looked at the man some more. He was breathing. He had a bruise on his left forearm, the outside of the arm, the kind you get when you raise it to block something coming at your head. Which meant at some point in the previous evening, before the whiskey took him under completely, somebody had swung something at his head. Maybe a rifle stock. I unhitched the mule and led it back to my place. I left Clem Purdy in the wagon. She was sitting at my table when I came back, looking at her own hands. I put the mule in the corral and came inside, and when she looked up I said, "Your name's Purdy," not a question. "I'm Cal Dunmore, this is my place." Something moved in her face. She looked back down at her hands. "He's in the ditch on the Hale Road," I said. "He's alive. He'll walk out when the whiskey's done with him." She folded her hands together on the table. They were not shaking. I went to the basin and washed up, and I said, still with my back to her, "I've got a spare room. Wasn't used since my brother came through 3 years back. You can have it long as you need it." I turned around. "I'm not asking for anything. I mean that plain." She looked at me, one eye open, one eye swollen shut. And she opened her mouth, and I watched her try, and nothing came. Not the silence of a woman who won't answer, the silence of a woman who can't. Something in me went very still. I said, "All right," and I turned back to the basin and finished washing, and I didn't make a thing of it. She had been mute for, I learned this slowly in pieces, the way you assemble something from parts scattered across a workroom floor, going on 2 years. The doctor in Hardesty, a man named Fenton who I happened to cross paths with at the feed store in Beaver some weeks after she came, told me what the thing was called. Trauma-induced mutism. He said sometimes the voice comes back, and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes you can't predict which. He said the best thing was not to force it, not to make a person feel as if they owed you words. He said it with a pointed quality that made me think he was making a general observation for my benefit. I didn't tell him who'd asked me to ask. She hadn't told me to ask either. She'd written it on a scrap of paper she could write and set it on my table one morning. What is wrong with me? Not a question. A statement, 3 words, like she already knew there was an answer and just wanted to hear it so it would be real. I wrote back, "I'm going into Beaver Thursday. Anything you need, write it down." She wrote information. What happened to the voice, and is it permanent? I said I'd find out, and I did. When I came back, I sat across from her at the table with the lantern between us, and I told her what Fenton had said, plain, without dressing it up. She sat and listened, and when I was done, she looked at the lantern for a while, and then she wrote on the paper, 2 years. "Yes," I said. She wrote, "He hit me with a bottle. I remember the sound. I don't remember anything else until 3 days later." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't either too large or too small. She looked at me across the lantern, and what was in her face was not pity for herself. It was more like a woman who has been told the name of a country she's been lost in, and the name doesn't make the country smaller, but at least she can write it on a map. She wrote, "Thank you for finding out." "Sure," I said. We sat there a while longer. Outside, the wind had come up and was pushing at the corners of the house the way it does on the Cimarron in fall, a low, insistent pressure like something trying to find a way in. The fire popped. One of the horses moved in the corral, a single thud of a hoof. She wrote one more thing before she went to bed. She set the pencil down and turned the paper around so I could read it, and she waited until I had. "Nora." "Good night, Nora," I said. She took the lantern, and she went down the hall. A man alone develops habits. The shape of a day becomes very fixed when you're the only person living it, and I had mine up before light, horses, coffee, whatever the land needed that day, dinner at dark, a book or nothing, sleep. There's a comfort in it. I won't pretend otherwise. There's also a hollowness in it that you don't notice until something fills the room where the hollowness was, and then you notice it all at once, like surfacing. She didn't get in the way of my habits. That was the first thing. She moved around my house like she'd been watching where not to step, which in the beginning was out of caution. A woman who has lived with a man who hits does not move carelessly through rooms, but after a few weeks it became something else. She learned where I was going to be before I was there, and she was already somewhere else, not hiding, just not in the road. In the morning she cooked. I came in from the horses to find the coffee on and bread in the pan, sometimes, or corn mush, or salt pork fried with a few dried peppers from the string I kept hanging near the stove. I hadn't asked her to cook. She just did it one morning and set a plate on the table and sat across from me with her own, and we ate. I realized after about a week that the house was cleaner than it had been in years. Not in an obvious way, she wasn't following me around with a broom, but things were in order. The corners weren't collecting debris. The window glass had been wiped. My brother's old room where she slept had a proper bed in it now, the old mattress restuffed with fresh straw, the frame squared up. I hadn't seen her do any of it, which meant she did it in the hours I was out, working steady and quiet. I noticed all of this and I didn't say much. Once I said, "You don't have to do all that." She looked at me and got the paper from her apron pocket. She kept a square of paper and a short pencil there now always, and she wrote, "I know." I let it go. What she needed, I thought, and I was working this out as I went. I want to be clear. I am not a man who has ever known a great deal about what women need, was not to be doing nothing. A woman who has been silenced has been told her only job is to exist quietly and not cause trouble, and the best thing I could do was not reinforce that. If she wanted to cook, she could cook. If she wanted to clean, she could clean. If she wanted to come out to the corral and watch me work the horses, which she did sometimes, standing on the fence rail with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned into the cold, she could do that. The horses liked her. Particularly the gray. She was a mare I'd had 6 years. The one I called Pearl on account of the color, and Pearl had always been particular about who came near her. She'd crowd you if she didn't want you around, and she'd bit a man's shoulder clean through a coat once. A man who came by looking to buy and put his hand on her too quick. But Nora walked up to Pearl the 3rd or 4th day, slow, hand out, and Pearl just dropped her head and snuffled at Nora's palm, and that was that. I watched from across the corral and I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. Clem Purdy came in November. I had been expecting it. Not soon, maybe. A man that drunk in a ditch in October needs some time to sort himself out before he goes anywhere, but I'd known he'd come. He wasn't the kind that let things go. You can tell from how a man hits. A man who hits because he's drunk and sorry does it different from a man who hits because he believes he's owed something. Nora's face, the way the blow had landed, the fact that it had happened before the one that took her voice, I knew what kind. He came on a Thursday afternoon, gray sky sitting low, smell of snow in the air. I was in the barn when I heard the horse on the road, and I came out and stood in the yard. He was a thin man, maybe 40, with the kind of weathered meanness that comes from years of losing things and blaming them on other people. He pulled up and looked down at me. "I'm looking for my wife," he said. "She's not here," I said. He looked at the house, smoke coming from the chimney. A woman's coat on the hook by the door. I hadn't thought to move it. "That right," he said. "That's right," I said. He got down from the horse slowly, like a man who intends to take his time about something. He was wearing a gun. Most men out here wore a gun, so that alone didn't mean much. But the way he wore it, low, tied, was the statement of a man who wanted you to notice. I didn't have a gun on me. My rifle was inside. The axe I'd been using was leaning against the splitting block to my right, close enough. He walked toward me. He stopped about 8 feet away, and he looked me over the way you look at a problem you're figuring the cost of. "I know she's here," he said. "Her and that mule. I found the mule's tracks back to your place." "Mule wandered," I said. "I got it in the corral. You can take it when you go." He smiled. "Not a pleasant thing. Cal Dunmore," he said. "I asked about you in Beaver. They say you're a man keeps to himself." "They're right," I said. "They say you're fair," he said, and the word was shaped like an accusation. "Man like that ought to understand a husband has a right to his wife." "She doesn't want to go with you," I said. "She tell you that?" I didn't answer. He took a step closer. "She can't tell anybody anything, last I heard, which tells you something, don't it, about what you're dealing with. A woman without a voice is not a reliable witness to her own opinions." I've thought about what happened next a good number of times since. I've thought about whether I made the right call and what the alternative was, and whether there was a cleaner way to handle it. I've come to the same place every time. I said, "Clem, you're going to get back on that horse. You're going to leave the mule. You're going to go back to Hardesty and file for divorce or move on or do whatever it is a man like you does when he's lost what he was too mean to keep. But you're not going back in that house." His hand went toward the gun. I picked up the axe. Not in a hurry. Just reached down and picked it up off the block and held it easy, let him see the weight of it. An axe isn't a gun. but a man who knows how to use one, and I have been cutting wood my whole life, since I was old enough to swing, can cover 8 feet fast enough that a man drawing a holstered gun does not have the time he thinks he has. He knew that. I watched him do the arithmetic. "You're going to ruin your life over another man's wife," he said. "Get on your horse," I said. He stood there a long time. The wind came off the flats and moved the dry sage and pushed some early snow flurries sideways across the yard. He looked at the house again. He looked at me. He got on his horse. He rode out slow, taking the South Fork of the road rather than the Hale Road, which was notable. The South Fork went to Hardesty. The Hale Road went north to the Territories, where a man might vanish into distance if he had to. He took the road toward town. I stood and watched until he was gone. Then I went inside. Nora was standing at the kitchen window. She'd been watching. I set the axe by the door and got the coffee pot and poured a cup and stood by the stove. After a minute, she came away from the window and sat down at the table. She got out her paper and pencil. She wrote, "He's going to come back." "Maybe," I said. She wrote, "You should have let me handle it." Something in my chest shifted at that, not amusement exactly, more like recognition. "How?" I said. She looked at the pencil in her hand, then back at me. She wrote, "I have been managing Clem Purdy for 12 years. I know how he works." "He had a gun," I said. She wrote, "He always has a gun. He has never used it because he is a coward and he knows I know it." She paused, then wrote one more line, "But I'm glad you were out there." I sat down across from her. The coffee was hot, and the snow was doing something more serious outside now, coming sideways in the wind, ticking against the window glass. We sat there while the storm made its mind up. Then she wrote, "Why are you doing this?" Not a question, the way she wrote things, no mark at the end, but she meant it as one. "I thought about it," I said, "because it needed doing." She looked at me. I said, "And because you carried my rifle to the barn in the dark and set it down careful. And anybody who thinks that far ahead when they're frightened is somebody worth knowing." She looked at me a long time. Then she looked down at the paper. Then she wrote, "That is the most peculiar reason I have ever heard." "It's the true one," I said. "He didn't come back." Word came to me sideways, the way word always comes in that country, carried by somebody who knows somebody, that Clem Purdy had shown up at the county seat and filed some papers or other, and then he'd left Hardesty for good, destination unknown. Whether he meant to cause more trouble from a distance or whether the distance just became permanent, I never found out. By spring, I had stopped thinking much about it. Winter closed down hard that year. The snows came proper in late November, and they stayed. For 6 weeks we were down to what the root cellar held and what the barn could shelter, and the world outside the stone house reduced itself to what was immediate and close. Horses, fire, food, sleep. The things that actually matter when everything else is stripped down. I found out that winter that Nora was a reader. She went through the shelf I had, which was not much, maybe 20 books, some going back to my father's place, with a focused, serious quality, like a woman getting through a job of work. She'd read a book and put it back and move to the next, and sometimes I'd come in and she'd be at the table with the lamp pulled close, deep in something. Once I came in and she was holding one of the books. It was a collection of poems, left by a woman I'd known briefly a long time ago, and I hadn't opened it in years, and she was sitting very still with it open in her lap, and her eyes were wet. She saw me see it. She closed the book and put it down and looked away. I went to the stove and poured myself coffee and didn't say anything, and after a while she picked the book back up. I can't explain why that mattered, it just did. There are things that happen in a winter spent close with another person that don't announce themselves. You learn how someone breathes at rest, what they sound like moving in the night, the specific weight of their silence when they're thinking versus when they're somewhere far away. I learned that Nora woke early, earlier than me, and didn't go back to sleep. I learned she liked her coffee with more grounds in it than most people would call coffee. I learned that when she was working, chopping the dried peppers or patching something that needed patching, she moved her lips, not speaking, just mouthing words, like she was talking to herself in the place where talking used to live. I never made anything of that, but I watched it sometimes. The land was teaching me something else. That piece of ground had been hard since I came to it, the soil thin in places, the water unreliable, the cattle markets what they were. I'd made it work 11 years through the simple fact of having nothing else to go to and being too hard-headed to admit it wasn't working. But that winter I found myself thinking about the East Pasture in a different way, about whether it needed to be run as a separate piece or turned to something else, about the creek draw and the water rights I hadn't pursued. Small shifts. The kind a man doesn't make when he's only living for himself, because the overhead of thinking about the future isn't worth it when the future is just more of this. I noticed this about myself, and I let it settle without examining it too hard. In February, she found the colt. I'd known one of the mares was going to drop early. She'd been looking tight for a week, but the cold had held and I'd been hoping she'd wait for March. She didn't. I was out at the barn for the morning feed when I found them both, the mare standing and the colt folded into the straw, still in the sack, the delivery so recent the cold hadn't touched him yet. He was small, too small, maybe, and his back legs were wrong, the way they sometimes come. He fought out of the sack, but he couldn't stand. I worked on him for an hour, got him warm, got him nursing, checked the legs. They weren't broken, just folded strange from the position he'd been in. I worked the joints as gentle as I knew how, which is to say patient, the way you'd work a green horse that doesn't know yet that you mean well. He was fighting, which was a good sign. When I came in for noon dinner, I must have looked like I felt, because Nora took one look at me and got her coat and went out without being asked. I went to the stove. She was out there a long time. When she came in, her hands were cold enough to be white at the knuckles and her coat had straw on it. She went to the basin and washed her hands. She came to the table and sat. She wrote. He stood up. I looked up. She wrote. He was wobbling, but he stood. She wrote one more line. He's a fighter. I let out something that was probably not dignified. She looked at me and something happened in her face that I hadn't seen yet, not a smile quite, but something that was what a smile comes from. Her eyes changed. The good one and the healing one both. I said, you warmed his legs. She wrote, the way you were working them. I just kept going. I thought about that, said good. She said nothing, but she didn't look away and neither did I for longer than was strictly about the colt. He was up proper by the end of the week. She named him, which I hadn't asked her to do, and she hadn't asked permission. She just wrote the name on a slip of paper and stuck it in the crack of the stall post. Jericho. I read it and looked at her and she looked back, and I thought it was probably the right name for a thing that should have fallen down and didn't. March came and then April, slow and green. The ground thawed in stages, the way it does, the top layer first and then the deeper cold working its way out over weeks. I started fence work in the East Pasture, riding the line, and some mornings she rode out with me on the mule that had belonged to the Purdy's and which she'd apparently claimed by occupation, and which I had no objection to. She learned the property the way she'd learned the house, quietly paying attention. One morning in early April, she rode alongside me to the top of the South Ridge, the one that looks back over the whole place. House, barn, the pastures opening up to the flats, the creek draw silver in the early light. She stopped the mule and looked at it. I looked at her looking at it. She reached into her coat pocket and got the paper and pencil. She wrote something and handed it across. Is this yours? Yes, I said. She took the paper back, wrote again. Handed it. All of it. All of it, I said. She looked out at the land again. I looked at the side of her face. The swelling had been gone since January. The split lip had healed. The eye that had been closed worked the same as the other now, or close enough. She looked like herself, which was a thing I'd come to know. High cheekbones, a straight mouth that did not arrange itself into expressions it didn't mean, dark hair going gray at the temples that she wore pinned back during the day. She handed me the paper again. She had written, it suits you. I didn't know exactly what to do with that. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. We rode back down. In May, the Hardesty schoolteacher came out to ask about the mule situation. There had apparently been some administrative question about the Purdy property and who owned what, and as the mule had been recovered at my place, I was part of it. I don't remember the teacher's name. What I remember is that he sat in my kitchen and talked at Nora directly, loudly, the way some people talk to the deaf, as if she might hear him better if he just put more force behind the words. Nora sat across from him with her paper and wrote her answers and slid them across the table, and he read them and talked loud again. After he left, I was standing at the window watching him go down the road, and I said, to no particular audience, "Man talks like she left her ears in Hardesty." I heard something from behind me. I turned around. Nora was standing at the table with her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were crinkled at the corners, and her shoulders were moving. She was laughing. Silently but laughing, the shape of it was completely clear, the whole structure of a laugh just without the sound. I looked at her. Something happened in my chest that I will not try to describe accurately because I don't think I have the words for it. I said, I know, I heard myself, it wasn't that clever. Her shoulders kept moving. I turned back to the window, but I was grinning and I wasn't trying to hide it. The night in June when it happened, we were on the porch. I had built that porch the second year on the place, when I'd gotten the walls up and the roof on, and had a moment to think about more than survival. It faced west, which meant the sunsets were long and considerable in the summer, the sky going through its colors for a good 20 minutes before it put itself to bed. I'd gotten in the habit of sitting out there after dinner with whatever was left in the coffee pot, and Nora had taken to sitting out there with me. We didn't talk. That is, I didn't talk much, and she didn't write much in those evening hours. Mostly we just sat with the sunset and the sound of the frogs starting up in the creek draw and the horses moving quietly in the corral. There's a quality to that kind of silence when it's between two people who have grown comfortable in it that is not empty. That's the only way I know to put it. It's full of something that doesn't need a name. That particular evening, the sunset was going lavender and orange, one of those complicated ones that can't make up its mind. A nighthawk was working the sky above the pasture in long arcing passes. I was watching it and thinking about nothing in particular, and then I heard something. A sound from beside me. Not a word, not quite. Something more like an attempt at a word. The shape of a word, the breath and the shape, but not the sound yet. Like something trying to come through a door that had been sealed a long time. I sat completely still. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on the nighthawk. I did not say anything, I barely breathed. There was a long silence. The nighthawk made its pass. The frogs carried on. And then quiet, rough from long disuse, like a hinge working itself loose. Cal. Just that, my name. I sat there with it. I don't know how long I sat there. The sky kept doing what it was doing. The nighthawk banked away somewhere toward the flats. The frogs, the horses, the wind in the sage. I said without moving, I'm here. Another long silence. I know, she said. Her voice was low and graveled from 2 years of silence, the way an instrument sounds when it hasn't been played in a long time, present but roughed up. It was her voice. I don't know how I knew that, having never heard it before, but I knew it the way you know a piece of country you've ridden in all seasons. It was hers. She didn't say anything else for a while. I said, you don't have to hurry it. I know, she said again, the second time easier than the first, not easy, but easier. We sat there as the light left. The lavender went to gray. The first star came out above the south ridge. She said slowly, working each word like it cost her, I thought it might not come back. It came back, I said. A pause, yes. I turned to look at her then. The last of the light was on her face. She was looking west at the place where the color had been. She said without looking at me, this is your fault. Is it, I said. You kept as she stopped. Swallowed, you kept talking to me, like I had answers. You did have answers, I said. You just wrote them. She turned to look at me. There are moments that happen between people that you know, as they're happening, that you will carry for the rest of whatever you have. I'm not going to dress it up, and I'm not going to make it into something it wasn't. We were two plain people on a porch at the end of a day, and she was looking at me with something in her face that was so straightforward and so whole that I had to look away for a second. Then I looked back. She reached out and put her hand on my arm, the way you reach for something you've been meaning to reach for and you've finally gotten there. She held on, not tight, just held. I put my hand over hers. We stayed like that until full dark. I want to tell you about the following months, not because things happened fast, they didn't, but because they matter. She worked at the voice the way she worked at everything, patient, steady, without making a performance of it. She'd go for hours without speaking and then say something practical and quiet, a word or a short sentence, testing the machinery. Some days it came easier and some days it retreated a little, and on the retreat days she went back to the paper without complaint. But it was coming. You could feel it, the way you feel a door working looser in its frame. One morning you push it and it opens clean. She could talk by the end of summer. Not the way she'd talked before, maybe. I had no way to know that, but in her own voice, low and direct, with a quality of choosing her words carefully that I suspected had been there before the silence, and the silence had simply made more visible. She did not talk to hear herself. She talked when she had something to say. Jericho, by August, was leggy and ridiculous and convinced he could run, which he could, though not as fast as he thought. She rode him before I did. She had his trust in a way I could not have replicated, built in the stall in the dark of February with cold hands and patience, and he responded to her the way all the horses did. There was something about her way with an animal that was simply there, as natural as anything. We put in a proper kitchen garden that fall. It was her idea. She drew a plan for it on one of her scraps of paper, set it on the table, said, "East of the house, the light's right." 2 words, maybe 3, not more, but said in the voice, which still made something in me settle when I heard it. I looked at the drawing. It was good. I said, "All right." We broke ground together. The night in November, a year near enough from when Clem Purdy had ridden into my yard, we were inside by the fire. The cold had come back and the land outside was settling into its winter thoughts. We'd had dinner and washed up, and she was reading and I was mending harness, which is the most boring piece of work a man can do, but it puts your hands somewhere while your mind goes where it wants. She set the book down. She said, "Cal." I said. She said, "I'm not." She stopped. She tried again. "I'm not leaving." I looked up. She was looking at the fire, not at me. She said, "I want you to know that. I'm not. I haven't been deciding whether to go. I'm not going." I sat with that. I said, "I know." She looked at me then. "Do you?" "Yes," I said. "How?" she said, which was a fair question. I thought about it. I said, "You named the colt." She looked at me like she was deciding if I was serious. Then something happened in her face, around the eyes, that quiet thing I'd learned to recognize. She said, "Jericho." "Jericho," I said. She picked up the book again. After a minute, I went back to the harness. The fire burned down and we let it. The cold outside was the kind that presses at windows, and inside the lamp was warm and the fire had left enough heat in the stones that the room was easy. She fell asleep in the chair, the book in her lap, and I got up quietly and put a blanket over her and went to bed. I lay there in the dark and I thought about what my life had been and what it was now, and those are 2 very different things. I'm not going to make a speech about it. A man alone on 160 acres, on a piece of ground that wanted him humbled, doing work that mostly nobody saw. And then this. A woman who carried a rifle carefully in the dark and sat in a barn and waited to see what kind of man I was and found out and stayed. There's a lot of things a man can want. I had found out that what I wanted most was to be worth staying for. She answered that question, quietly without making an event of it, the way she did most things. By the following spring the valley knew. I don't mean we announced anything or made any declaration. I mean that the valley knew the way a valley knows anything, through what was visible, through what people saw when they came to the Dunmore place to deal over cattle or trade or whatever other business brought them out. They saw the kitchen garden. They saw the porch where 2 chairs sat. They saw Nora on Jericho working the east pasture line, easy in the saddle, talking with a hand she'd hired on for spring roundup like a woman who has run an operation before and will again. They saw me, probably. The difference in a man is not always a thing he can see in himself, but it seems to show. The feed store man in Beaver told me once offhand that I was looking well. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said thanks and paid for my order, but I carried it home. There was a morning, late May, the grass green and the light clean after days of rain, when I was out early on the South Ridge walking the fence, and I stopped at the top where you can see all of it. The house, the barn, the corral where Jericho was doing his morning nonsense, the garden coming in along the east wall, the pastures running out to the flats. I heard hooves on the grass below, looked down. She was coming up on the mule, not in any hurry, picking the same line I always rode. She came up alongside me and stopped and looked out at the same thing I was looking at. She said, "Same as last year." "Getting better," I said. She looked at me sideways, the way she had, direct, not letting things go. "The east pasture's going to need a second water point," she said. "I know," I said, thinking about the draw. "The draw," she said, and nodded and looked back out. We stood there. Then she said quietly, "Cal." "Yeah," I said. She didn't say anything for a moment. The wind came across the flats, warm going, the first real warm of the year. It moved her hair. She said, "I'm glad it was your place." The words were plain. She meant them plain. That's the kind of woman she was. I said, "So am I." She looked at the land for a while more. Then she turned the mule and rode back down, and I watched her go, easy, sure, no part of it uncertain. And then I turned and looked out at the flats for a long time before I followed. This is mine, I thought, the land, the work, the place. And her choosing it, choosing all of it. A man can do worse. A man can do a lot worse.